Some people think a master key can open every lock. The funny thing is, it can't unlock the truth. The sharp click echoed across the quiet parking lot just after sunrise, followed by a frustrated sigh that carried farther than the morning breeze. I didn't even have to look up from my coffee to know someone was standing beside my SUV. The rich smell of roasted beans mixed with freshly cut grass drifting across Willow Creek Estates, and somewhere in the distance, an automatic sprinkler hissed to life. Then came another click. Slower this time. More determined. Whoever was trying to unlock my driver's door honestly believed they had every right to do it. I set my paper cup on the hood and watched through the reflection in the tinted glass as Patricia Holloway, president of our HOA, frowned at the silver key dangling from a bright blue lanyard labeled Master Access. She twisted it again. Nothing. She tried the passenger door. Another metallic click. Another failure. Her smile disappeared. Mine never showed up in the first place. I'd only lived in the neighborhood for 6 weeks, but Patty had already introduced herself 3 separate times, each visit ending with a reminder that community standards existed for everyone's benefit. Translation: she believed the neighborhood belonged to her. Every mailbox, every driveway, every flower bed, every parked vehicle. According to Patty, homeowners merely borrowed what the HOA generously allowed them to enjoy. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. White designer sneakers. Perfectly pressed pastel jacket. Expensive perfume floating through the cool Texas air. Clipboard tucked beneath one arm like a badge of authority. And hanging from that blue lanyard was the famous master key she loved showing off at monthly meetings. She called it the symbol of responsibility. I was beginning to suspect she viewed it as a license to cross boundaries. She stepped back from my SUV and looked around the parking lot, almost disappointed that nobody had witnessed her failed attempt. Then her eyes landed on me. I stood only 20 feet away beside the clubhouse sidewalk, coffee in one hand, calm enough that it seemed to irritate her even more. "Sir," she called loudly, "this vehicle doesn't belong here." I glanced toward the black SUV gleaming beneath the morning sun. "Pretty sure it does." Her jaw tightened. "My master key opens every registered resident vehicle in this community. Yours didn't open. Which means it's unauthorized." I nearly laughed, but something about the certainty in her voice stopped me. She truly believed that failed key proved I was the problem. Not her assumption. Not her actions. Me. Before I could answer, she pulled out her phone, tapped 3 numbers with dramatic confidence, and lifted it to her ear. "Yes," she said loudly enough for nearby dog walkers to hear, "I'd like to report a suspicious individual occupying a vehicle that appears to have been brought into our community illegally." The birds seemed to stop singing for a second. Even the sprinklers felt quieter. I watched her invent a story one sentence at a time while keeping one hand wrapped around that useless master key. What Patty didn't know was that the lock she'd failed to open wasn't the biggest mistake she'd made that morning. Ethan Caldwell. 42 years old. Most people who met me for the first time guessed I worked somewhere in finance because I preferred quiet suits over loud conversations and drove a practical sport utility vehicle instead of something designed to impress strangers. None of them knew I had reached a point in life where I no longer needed expensive things to prove anything. After years of building a successful logistics and security technology company, I had more money than I ever imagined growing up in rural Texas. I sold most of my shares 2 years earlier, and for the first time in decades, I finally had room to breathe. I bought a modest home inside Willow Creek Estates for one simple reason. Peace. My father used to tell me that a house should lower your heartbeat the moment you pulled into the driveway. Mine never cared about luxury. He was a mechanic who believed every tool had a purpose and every promise should be kept. Saturday mornings smelled like motor oil, fresh coffee, and cedar sawdust because there was always something around the house worth fixing. He taught me to tighten every bolt twice, read every contract twice, and never assume someone wearing a title deserved your trust. Those lessons stayed with me long after he was gone. The black sport utility vehicle sitting in my driveway was another reminder of him. It was not flashy. It was dependable. I had customized it carefully over several months with security upgrades, reinforced electronics, and a locking system built by engineers from one of my former companies. Every feature had been installed legally and professionally. To anyone else it looked ordinary. That was exactly how I liked it. My neighbor across the street, Claire Bennett, had introduced herself during my first week with a homemade apple pie and a folder full of neighborhood recommendations. She was a real estate attorney with a quick smile and the rare ability to listen before speaking. Unlike everyone else, she never asked what I did for a living. She simply welcomed me and reminded me that not every person in the neighborhood agreed with how the homeowners association operated. At the time I smiled politely and assumed she was exaggerating. Then I met Patricia Holloway. Over the following weeks, I watched delivery drivers apologize for parking too long, teenagers receive lectures for riding bicycles across the clubhouse sidewalk, and elderly neighbors quietly accept warning letters over flower pots that were apparently the wrong color. Nobody argued. They simply nodded, signed whatever paper Patty placed in front of them, and walked away looking smaller than when the conversation began. It fascinated me how quickly ordinary people surrendered when someone sounded official enough. That morning, while Patty confidently spoke to the emergency dispatcher, I realized something important. She had not called because she believed a crime had happened. She had called because she expected everyone else to believe whatever she said before asking a single question. She was about to discover that assumptions have a habit of collapsing the moment they collide with facts. The first patrol car rolled into the parking lot with its lights off, moving slowly enough that the tires barely disturbed the loose gravel near the entrance. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out first, followed by a younger officer carrying a small notebook. Neither of them looked excited. If anything, they looked like men who had answered one too many neighborhood disputes before breakfast. Patty marched toward them before they even closed their doors, waving that blue lanyard like it was an official credential issued by the state. Her perfume drifted through the warm morning air as she spoke rapidly, pointing at me, then at my vehicle, then back at the key still hanging from her hand. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough to understand the story she was creating. Suspicious vehicle. Unauthorized resident. Refused to cooperate. Possible stolen property. Every sentence sounded polished, almost rehearsed, as though she had delivered the same performance before. Officer Brooks finally turned toward me. His expression stayed calm. "Good morning, sir. We just need to ask you a few questions." I nodded, keeping my coffee in one hand. Of course. Patty looked disappointed that I had not become angry. She had expected an argument. Instead, she found patience, and patience has a strange way of making dishonest people uncomfortable. Claire appeared across the street carrying a leather briefcase, slowing her pace the moment she realized patrol cars had arrived. She watched quietly from the sidewalk without interrupting, her eyes moving from Patty's master key to my sport utility vehicle and then back to the officers. She knew enough about legal disputes to recognize when someone was trying to establish a narrative before the facts had been verified. As Officer Brooks asked for my driver's license, Patty could not resist speaking over him. "Tell them about the key," she insisted. "Every registered homeowner vehicle responds to this access system. Mine opens every authorized garage gate, every clubhouse entrance, every maintenance lock. If it cannot access his vehicle, then something is wrong." Officer Brooks looked at the key for a long second before returning it to her hand without comment. I noticed something in his expression. Curiosity. Not agreement. That tiny difference mattered. Patty interpreted silence as support. Experienced officers often used silence to gather information. Around us, morning life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. A lawn mower hummed somewhere behind the clubhouse. A golden retriever pulled its owner down the walking trail. Fresh coffee drifted from the community cafe across the street. Yet the atmosphere felt different, charged with quiet expectation. I had spent enough years watching people under pressure to recognize the pattern. The louder Patty became, the more carefully everyone else listened. She believed authority came from speaking first and speaking the longest. She had no idea that real authority usually waited until every fact was on the table before making a single decision. That difference was about to change everything. Officer Brooks examined my driver's license for only a few seconds before handing it back with a polite nod. "Everything matches the registration," he said calmly. Patty blinked as though she had misheard him. "That cannot be right," she replied, stepping closer. "Run it again." "His vehicle is not responding to the community access key." The younger officer looked from her key to my vehicle with visible confusion. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "vehicle door locks are not connected to homeowners association access systems." Patty dismissed him with a wave of her hand. "You are missing the point. This key has worked for years. It opens community facilities and maintenance areas. It should identify authorized residents." I watched Officer Brooks choose his words with remarkable patience. A private vehicle is not required to recognize any community key. The silence that followed felt heavier than the humid Texas air. Patty's confidence cracked for only a second before she recovered with even greater determination. Then he must have altered something. Nobody installs unusual security unless they are hiding something. I could smell fresh mulch warming beneath the rising sun while a delivery truck rolled slowly through the front entrance, its brakes giving off a faint metallic squeak. Ordinary sounds continued around us, but every nearby homeowner had quietly stopped pretending not to watch. Curtains shifted. Garage doors remained half open. People walking their dogs suddenly found reasons to pause near the clubhouse. Willow Creek Estates had become an audience. Claire finally crossed the street, stopping several feet away without interrupting anyone. She simply observed, her eyes following every exchange with the calm focus of someone trained to notice details others ignored. Patty immediately pointed toward her. "Claire, tell them I know the rules. Tell them I have protected this neighborhood for years." Claire answered without emotion. "I know you enforce the rules. Whether every decision follows the law is a different question." Patty stiffened. That was the first time anyone had openly challenged her authority in front of witnesses. Officer Brooks cleared his throat. "Sir, do you mind if I ask why your vehicle has enhanced security?" It was a fair question. I smiled politely. "Because I prefer to keep my property secure." He nodded once. That answer seemed sufficient for him. It was certainly not sufficient for Patty. "Enhanced security," she repeated loudly. "Exactly." He admitted it. "Normal residents do not need security like that." I noticed several neighbors exchanging puzzled looks. One older gentleman quietly shook his head before continuing his morning walk. The narrative Patty had worked so hard to build was beginning to unravel, not because anyone argued with her, but because reality refused to cooperate. The more she spoke, the more obvious it became that every conclusion she reached depended on assumptions instead of evidence. Standing there beneath the bright morning sky, listening to birds settle onto freshly trimmed oak branches, I realized this was no longer about one mistaken phone call. It was about a pattern. Patty believed confidence could replace proof, and nobody had challenged that belief for a very long time. Officer Brooks thanked me for my cooperation and took one last look at the registration on his tablet before slipping it back into the patrol car. "Everything appears to be in order, sir. Unless there is something else, you are free to continue your morning." Those words should have ended the entire misunderstanding. Instead, they seemed to fuel Patty's determination. Her face tightened, and she stepped directly between the officers and my vehicle as if refusing to let reality move forward. "No," she insisted. "This neighborhood has standards. You cannot simply leave because your paperwork looks correct. There is still the issue of unauthorized security modifications." Officer Brooks answered politely. "There is no law preventing someone from improving the security of a privately owned vehicle." Patty folded her arms. "There should be. Residents cannot install systems that interfere with community management." Claire quietly raised an eyebrow, but she remained silent. I could almost hear my father reminding me that the loudest person in a disagreement is rarely the one holding the strongest facts. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh pine mulch across the parking lot while the clubhouse flag fluttered softly overhead. It should have been a peaceful morning. Instead, every passing minute revealed another layer of Patty's confidence in rules that seemed to exist only inside her own mind. She reached into her clipboard and produced several printed pages. "These are notices I have prepared for repeated non-compliance," she announced, handing them toward me. I accepted them without argument. One cited unauthorized vehicle appearance. Another questioned aftermarket electronic equipment visible through the windshield. A third claimed my driveway parking habits disrupted community uniformity. I read each page carefully before looking back up. Every notice referenced general language about preserving neighborhood aesthetics, yet none actually prohibited what she accused me of doing. Claire noticed the same thing immediately. She glanced at the papers from several feet away and gave the slightest shake of her head. Patty interpreted my silence as surrender. "You see," she said confidently to the officers, "this is exactly why firm enforcement matters. People always cooperate once they realize the association has authority." I simply folded the notices and placed them inside my jacket pocket. There was no reason to debate legal language in the middle of a parking lot. Facts were patient. They did not become stronger because someone raised their voice. Several homeowners who had gathered nearby slowly began returning to their morning routines, but I noticed many of them looking back over their shoulders. They had expected another loud confrontation. Instead, they watched someone calmly accept accusations without giving the reaction Patty clearly wanted. That unexpected calm unsettled her more than any argument could have. As the patrol car prepared to leave, Officer Brooks offered a courteous nod. "If either of you needs anything further, contact the department through the non-emergency number." Patty forced a smile until the officers drove away. The moment the patrol car disappeared beyond the entrance gate, the smile vanished with it. She looked directly at me and said in a low, controlled voice, "This conversation is not over." I believed her. More importantly, I had the unmistakable feeling that this had never really been about my vehicle at all. It was about testing whether someone new in the neighborhood would quietly accept authority without ever asking where that authority truly ended. The next 48 hours unfolded exactly the way I expected, although I will admit I had hoped to be wrong. Every morning another envelope appeared in my mailbox with crisp white paper and bold lettering across the top. Courtesy notice. Compliance reminder. Final warning. Each document sounded more urgent than the last, yet every accusation grew weaker the moment I compared it with the actual neighborhood bylaws. The smell of fresh ink still lingered on the pages when I laid them across my kitchen table beside a cup of black coffee. Sunlight poured through the windows, catching tiny dust particles drifting through the quiet room while the ceiling fan hummed overhead. My house remained peaceful even as someone outside seemed determined to manufacture conflict. Claire stopped by that Thursday evening carrying copies of the recorded covenants she had downloaded from the county records office. We spread the documents across the dining room table and compared every citation Patty had written with the governing rules. Claire traced one paragraph with her finger and smiled. "She keeps referencing general maintenance language," she said. "But there is nothing here giving the association authority over private vehicle security systems." I nodded without saying much. That was not the surprising part. What interested me more was the pattern. Every notice quoted broad language while quietly avoiding the sections that limited the association's actual authority. It was a strategy built on confidence rather than precision. Most homeowners probably never questioned it. They simply paid fines or changed whatever Patty demanded because challenging paperwork felt exhausting. The following morning I noticed something else. Patty walked through the neighborhood carrying that same blue lanyard, stopping at garages, storage rooms, utility closets, and maintenance gates. Every few minutes I heard the soft metallic click of another lock opening. Homeowners greeted her politely as she passed, almost automatically stepping aside whenever she approached. It was remarkable how much influence one small key seemed to carry. Yet the more I watched, the more I realized something did not fit. She treated every lock as though it existed for her personal convenience rather than for a specific community purpose. By late afternoon another letter arrived, this one requesting that I present my vehicle for what she called a mandatory neighborhood security inspection before the weekend. I read the page twice before setting it aside. There was no bylaw authorizing inspections of privately owned vehicles. None. Claire reached the same conclusion within minutes after I sent her a photograph of the notice. She is escalating because she expected you to give in, she told me over the phone. Instead, every calm response forces her to invent a new reason. I looked through the front window toward the quiet street where children rode bicycles beneath tall oak trees and neighbors watered flower beds in the fading golden light. Everything about Willow Creek Estates looked like the picture of suburban peace. Yet hidden beneath the carefully trimmed hedges and spotless sidewalks, someone had become so comfortable stretching the limits of authority that she no longer seemed to recognize where those limits ended. That realization stayed with me far longer than any warning letter ever could. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and the faint scent of fresh-cut grass drifting through the open kitchen window. I carried my coffee onto the front porch and watched the neighborhood settle into its familiar routine. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, sprinklers swept neat arcs across emerald lawns, and somewhere a wind chime tapped softly against a wooden beam. Everything looked perfectly ordinary until Patty appeared again with that blue lanyard hanging from her neck. This time I decided not to watch her casually. I paid attention. She stopped beside the community storage building and unlocked the door. That made sense. She walked to the clubhouse and opened another lock. Still reasonable. Then she crossed to the row of detached garages owned by several residents and used the same key again. I noticed one homeowner was away for the weekend because his truck had been gone since Friday evening, yet Patty still opened his garage door halfway, looked inside for a few seconds, and quietly closed it again before continuing her walk. She never carried a maintenance checklist. She never took photographs. She simply looked around as though every locked space in Willow Creek Estates naturally belonged to her. The moment stayed with me long after she disappeared around the corner. Later that afternoon I met Claire outside the mailbox pavilion, where the smell of warm cedar mixed with paper and fresh printer ink from stacks of community newsletters. I mentioned what I had seen. She became unusually quiet. "You are not the first person to notice something similar," she admitted. Most people assumed inspections were part of her responsibilities, but nobody has ever explained why they happen without notice. That single sentence shifted something in my mind. Up until then I believed Patty's greatest problem was misunderstanding the limits of her authority. Now I began wondering whether she fully understood those limits and simply expected nobody else to question them. When I returned home, I reviewed every notice she had delivered and arranged them across the dining room table beside copies of the recorded covenants Claire had printed. Patterns slowly emerged. Dates matched days when several homeowners had been traveling. Certain warning letters referenced conditions that would have required someone to look inside fenced areas or private structures. The timing was too consistent to ignore. My instincts, sharpened by years of solving complicated problems where details mattered, quietly reminded me that unusual behavior often appears ordinary until someone places each small piece beside the next one. By sunset the neighborhood looked peaceful again. Porch lights glowed one by one as evening settled over Willow Creek Estates, and the distant aroma of backyard barbecue drifted through the cooling air. Yet beneath that picture of suburban calm, one question refused to leave my mind. How many times had that blue master key opened a door it was never intended to unlock, and how many homeowners had accepted it simply because nobody had ever stopped to ask whether it should have happened in the first place? Monday morning brought a steady rain that left the sidewalks glistening beneath gray skies, and the entire neighborhood seemed quieter than usual. The soft rhythm of water dripping from oak leaves mixed with the distant hum of passing traffic beyond the entrance gate. I spent most of the morning at my dining room table with a legal pad, copies of every notice Patty had delivered, and the recorded homeowners association documents Claire had obtained from the county clerk. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room while page after page slowly revealed something far more interesting than a disagreement over parking or security systems. It was not one mistake. It was a pattern. Every warning letter followed the same formula. Broad language. Confident conclusions. Very little connection to the actual governing documents. Claire arrived just after noon carrying another folder that contained publicly available board meeting minutes from previous years. We compared dates, signatures, and policy changes one by one. Several motions referenced expanded inspection procedures, yet none of them had ever been formally adopted through the amendment process required by the association's own governing rules. Someone had gradually blurred the line between recommendations and enforceable authority until most residents no longer recognized the difference. Claire quietly circled several passages with a yellow marker. These policies were discussed, she said. They were never approved. That single observation explained why Patty always quoted summaries instead of the original documents. Later that afternoon I walked through the neighborhood under a black umbrella, exchanging friendly greetings with homeowners who had become increasingly curious after the incident in the clubhouse parking lot. An older couple mentioned receiving violation notices while visiting family out of state. Another resident laughed nervously as he admitted Patty once commented on boxes inside his detached garage even though he had never invited anyone inside. None of them sounded angry. They sounded resigned. They had accepted unusual behavior because everyone assumed someone else had already confirmed it was allowed. Back home I organized every conversation into simple notes without drawing conclusions too quickly. Experience had taught me that facts become valuable only after they can stand on their own without assumptions. By early evening the rain finally stopped, leaving the air cool and carrying the earthy scent of wet cedar mulch across the neighborhood. As the clouds broke apart, sunlight reflected off puddles lining the quiet streets, giving Willow Creek Estates the peaceful appearance people expected from a well-maintained community. Yet beneath that calm surface, small pieces were beginning to fit together. A key used more often than necessary. Inspection notices unsupported by governing documents. Residents who quietly accepted practices they had never questioned. None of those details proved misconduct by themselves, but together they formed a picture that deserved a much closer look. Sitting beside the front window as daylight faded, I realized I was no longer dealing with an isolated misunderstanding. I was looking at a system that had operated the same way for years simply because nobody had taken the time to compare confidence with evidence. By the middle of the week I stopped looking at the situation as a disagreement between one homeowner and an overconfident association president. Instead, I treated it the same way I had approached every complicated problem throughout my career. Slow down. Verify every fact. Ignore assumptions. The morning air carried the clean scent of rain-soaked grass as I met Claire at a small coffee shop just outside the neighborhood entrance. Steam drifted from fresh mugs while quiet conversations blended with the soft sound of cups being placed on wooden tables. Claire opened a folder that had grown noticeably thicker since our first meeting. Inside were property records, archived newsletters, meeting agendas, and copies of old correspondence volunteered by several homeowners who had quietly reached out after hearing about my encounter in the parking lot. Nobody sounded interested in revenge. They simply wanted to understand whether the rules they had followed for years had actually existed in the form they had been described. One retired accountant brought us every assessment notice he had received over the previous 5 years. A young couple shared emails asking them to allow access to their detached storage unit without citing any specific bylaw. Another neighbor produced photographs showing maintenance staff entering fenced common utility areas on days that did not match scheduled inspections. None of those documents proved wrongdoing by themselves, but each one added another small piece to the same puzzle. Claire organized everything with remarkable precision, grouping similar events by date instead of by homeowner. That simple decision exposed a pattern I had not noticed before. Inspection activity increased immediately before board meetings. Warning letters often appeared within 24 hours after those inspections. Recommendations somehow transformed into mandatory requirements without any recorded vote from the association membership. I found myself appreciating Claire's methodical approach. She never exaggerated what a document meant. If a conclusion could not be supported by the paperwork, she refused to make it. That discipline mattered because facts lose their value the moment someone stretches them beyond what they actually prove. Over the next several days, more residents quietly joined the conversation. They stopped by my porch while walking their dogs or waved me down during evening strolls beneath the oak trees. Most began their stories the same way. I thought it was just me. Those 5 words explained why nothing had changed for so long. Each homeowner believed they were experiencing an isolated inconvenience instead of recognizing a shared pattern. As the sun settled behind the rooftops one evening, golden light reflected across the windows of the clubhouse while a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the neighborhood. Willow Creek Estates still looked like the peaceful community I had hoped to find when I moved there. The difference was that I no longer viewed it through the same eyes. I now understood that confidence can become surprisingly persuasive when it goes unchallenged year after year. Fortunately, confidence has one weakness. It rarely survives careful documentation, patient observation, and people who decide to compare every confidence statement against the actual facts. The monthly Homeowners Association meeting arrived on a cool Thursday evening, and by the time I walked toward the clubhouse, the parking lot was already filling with familiar vehicles. The scent of freshly watered flower beds mixed with the aroma of brewed coffee drifting through the open entrance doors. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows beneath bright ceiling lights, and quiet conversations echoed across polished hardwood floors. Patty stood near the front of the room greeting residents with the same practiced smile she always wore, clipboard tucked beneath one arm and the blue master key hanging proudly from its familiar lanyard. If anyone had walked in for the first time, they would have assumed they were looking at the most dedicated volunteer in the neighborhood. Claire took a seat a few rows behind me, carrying only a legal pad and a folder that remained closed on her lap. Around us, several homeowners I had spoken with over the past week exchanged polite greetings, but I noticed something different in their expressions. They were paying attention now. Instead of accepting every statement without question, they listened carefully before nodding. The meeting began with landscaping updates, budget summaries, and routine maintenance reports. Everything sounded ordinary until Patty reached the section labeled Community Compliance. She looked directly toward me before clearing her throat. Some residents, she announced, have recently questioned established procedures that have protected this neighborhood for many years. A few people shifted in their chairs, but nobody interrupted. She continued by describing the importance of cooperation, respect for association leadership, and the dangers of ignoring community standards. Not once did she mention any specific bylaw. She relied entirely on broad language and confident delivery, just as every notice on my dining room table had done. When she finished, the room remained unusually quiet. Then one homeowner slowly raised his hand. He asked where the authority for vehicle inspections appeared in the governing documents. Patty answered without opening the rulebook beside her. Another resident politely asked whether inspection policies had ever been approved through a membership vote. Claire calmly opened her folder but still said nothing. A retired accountant requested clarification regarding notices issued while homeowners were traveling out of state. With each question, the atmosphere changed. Nobody sounded hostile. They simply wanted clear answers supported by actual documents. Patty's confident smile began to fade as she flipped through loose papers searching for language that never appeared where she expected it to be. The quiet confidence that had once controlled the room gradually shifted toward the residents asking respectful, well-documented questions. I remained silent, listening more than speaking, because this was never about winning an argument. It was about allowing facts to stand on their own. As the evening continued, I realized something important. The strongest challenge to misplaced authority was not anger. It was preparation. Every careful question forced assumptions to compete against written records, and written records have a remarkable habit of remaining exactly the same no matter who happens to be holding the microphone. The room grew so quiet that I could hear the air conditioning cycle on above the ceiling tiles. Patty looked around the clubhouse as though she expected someone to rescue the conversation, but nobody spoke. The homeowners who had once accepted every statement without hesitation were now waiting for something far more valuable than confidence. They were waiting for proof. Claire finally opened the folder that had rested on her lap all evening and slid several copies of the recorded governing documents toward the board members seated at the front table. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice. Just neatly organized records highlighted beside the exact sections that applied. One board member adjusted his reading glasses and quietly compared the highlighted pages with the policy summary Patty had been quoting from throughout the meeting. His expression changed almost immediately. Another director leaned closer, reading the same passages for himself. The difference between the official documents and the unofficial procedures was impossible to ignore once they appeared side by side. Patty attempted to regain control of the discussion by insisting that long-standing practice carried the same weight as written policy, but the words no longer landed the way they once had. The questions became more precise. Which vote authorized inspections of private property? Where was the amendment approving expanded enforcement authority? Which meeting minutes documented those changes? Every answer led back to another document that did not exist. I remained seated until one of the directors looked directly at me and asked whether I wished to add anything. I stood slowly, smoothing the sleeve of my jacket before speaking. Only one thing, I said. Authority works best when everyone understands exactly where it begins and exactly where it ends. I reached into my inside pocket and removed a leather credential wallet that had remained there since the morning Patty first called the police. I opened it just long enough for the board members and the officers who had quietly entered the back of the clubhouse a few moments earlier to recognize the official identification inside. My name is Ethan Caldwell, I said evenly. I serve as a deputy United States Marshal assigned to a federal task force. My work requires careful documentation, respect for legal boundaries, and patience before reaching conclusions. Those same principles matter just as much in a neighborhood meeting as they do anywhere else. Nobody gasped. Nobody shouted. The surprise settled over the room in complete silence. Officer Brooks, who had responded to Patty's original call days earlier, gave me a brief nod of recognition from the rear of the clubhouse. He had understood much more than he let on during that first encounter. Patty stared at me without speaking, her confident expression replaced by genuine uncertainty for the first time since I had moved into Willow Creek Estates. She had spent days assuming that appearances told the whole story. Instead, she had judged someone she had never truly taken the time to know. Around the room, homeowners began looking at the documents instead of at personalities, and that simple shift changed everything. The discussion was no longer about me, my vehicle, or a blue master key. It had become a conversation about accountability, written rules, and the responsibility that comes with any position of trust. Once the facts finally occupied the center of the room, assumptions quietly disappeared on their own. The meeting did not end with raised voices or dramatic speeches. It ended with paperwork being read carefully for the first time in years. One by one, the board members compared the official governing documents with the procedures that had gradually become accepted as if they were binding rules. The quiet rustle of printed pages replaced the confident rhythm of Patty's presentations, and that simple sound carried more weight than any argument ever could. A motion was made to suspend enforcement of every disputed policy until an independent legal review could be completed. Another board member requested that all future compliance notices reference the exact section of the recorded covenants supporting each decision. Every proposal received thoughtful discussion instead of automatic approval. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse felt completely different. The tension that had filled the room earlier slowly gave way to something much healthier. Transparency. Residents who had remained silent for years finally asked questions without looking over their shoulders first. Several volunteered to serve on a committee that would review association procedures and recommend changes based strictly on the governing documents. Claire accepted an invitation to assist the committee in an advisory role, making it clear that her only interest was helping the community understand its own rules. Nobody objected. Even the board members seemed relieved to replace uncertainty with clarity. Patty remained seated at the front table, unusually quiet, listening as the organization she had led for years began correcting its course. No one insulted her. No one celebrated her embarrassment. The discussion stayed focused on policies instead of personalities because lasting solutions rarely come from public humiliation. They come from better systems. Over the following weeks, homeowners received written notices explaining that previous compliance actions would be reviewed individually wherever questions existed regarding proper authority. Several assessments were withdrawn after documentation showed they had relied on procedures that had never been formally adopted. New training sessions were scheduled for board members, emphasizing the difference between community preferences and enforceable rules. The famous Blue Master Key was reassigned to maintenance personnel with written access logs documenting every authorized use. Simple accountability accomplished what years of assumptions never could. One evening I walked through Willow Creek Estates as the setting sun painted long golden shadows across the sidewalks. Children laughed near the playground while neighbors chatted from front porches without the uneasy caution I had noticed during my first weeks in the neighborhood. The scent of fresh jasmine drifted through the cooling air, and for the first time since moving there, the place finally felt like the peaceful community I believed I had purchased. Claire smiled as we crossed paths near the mailbox pavilion. "Funny how much changes once everyone starts reading the same rulebook," she said. I smiled back because she was right. The greatest change had never been the revelation of my profession. That had simply reminded people that titles do not define authority nearly as much as integrity does. Real trust is built when rules are applied fairly, questions are welcomed, and every decision can stand on its own without relying on fear, assumptions, or someone else's confidence. In the end, the strongest lock protecting any community was never a master key. It was accountability. 6 months passed more quickly than I expected, and one crisp autumn morning I found myself standing on the same front porch where this entire story had quietly begun. The air carried the familiar scent of fresh coffee, cedar mulch, and leaves just beginning to turn golden beneath the Texas sun. Somewhere down the street, children laughed while riding bicycles without their parents constantly watching from the windows. A delivery driver waved as he passed through the neighborhood entrance instead of nervously searching for someone with a clipboard. Small moments like those told me more about the community than any official report ever could. Willow Creek Estates had not become perfect. No neighborhood ever does. Lawns still needed mowing. Budgets still required debate. Neighbors still disagreed from time to time. The difference was that people now understood the rules belonged to everyone, not to the loudest voice in the room. Board meetings had changed as well. Every agenda included references to the exact governing documents supporting each proposal. Homeowners received drafts before important votes, questions were welcomed instead of discouraged, and meeting minutes were posted for everyone to review. Transparency, I discovered, has a quiet way of reducing unnecessary conflict. Claire eventually accepted a permanent advisory position to help ensure future policy updates followed the proper legal process. She approached every discussion with the same calm professionalism that first convinced me she cared more about fairness than winning arguments. Watching her work reminded me that genuine leadership rarely seeks attention. It simply earns trust over time through consistency and honesty. As for Patty, she gradually stepped away from public leadership after the board completed its transition. We crossed paths only a handful of times afterward. Our conversations remained polite, brief, and respectful. Life has a remarkable way of teaching lessons that no courtroom or neighborhood meeting ever could. Sometimes the greatest consequence is simply discovering that authority without accountability cannot last forever. My black sport utility vehicle still sits in the driveway exactly where it always has. Every time I hear its locks engage with a quiet click, I remember the morning when one small key failed to open one ordinary door and unexpectedly opened something much larger instead. It encouraged an entire neighborhood to ask better questions, read its own rules, and replace assumptions with facts. Looking back now, I realize the story was never really about a vehicle, a key, or even my profession. Those were only pieces of a much larger lesson. Communities thrive when ordinary people choose curiosity over fear, documentation over rumor, and integrity over convenience. I have spent much of my career believing that justice is built one careful decision at a time, never through shortcuts and never through intimidation. That belief followed me into this neighborhood, and in the end it proved just as valuable here as anywhere else. My father used to tell me that the strongest lock in the world is an honest reputation, because once people know they can trust your word, very few doors remain closed for long. Standing on my porch as another peaceful morning settled over Willow Creek Estates, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Justice is not loud. It is patient, prepared, and sooner or later, it always finds the right key.